The Zephyrian Empire's War Council chamber was a masterpiece of military architecture, all gleaming chrome and holographic displays that pulsed with the kind of authoritative lighting that screamed, "We take ourselves very seriously." Around the central tactical table stood the finest military minds the Empire had to offer, which was either very impressive or deeply concerning, depending on your perspective on what constituted military brilliance. General Krexvor dominated the room with the kind of presence that comes from being 7 feet tall, covered in chitinous armor, and possessing the unshakable confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by applying sufficient amounts of laser fire. His species had evolved from apex predators, which explained both their natural aggression and their unfortunate tendency to assume that being at the top of one food chain automatically qualified them for the top of all food chains. "Esteemed commanders," Krexvor announced, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone about to propose something that sounded brilliant in theory. "Today we discuss the conquest of the third planet in the Sol system. Intelligence reports indicate a species that calls itself humanity." Commander Zilthura, whose pale blue skin and 3 eyes gave her the appearance of someone perpetually skeptical about everything, shifted uncomfortably at her station. As the Empire's chief intelligence officer, she had the unfortunate job of being the voice of reason in a room full of beings who considered charge first, ask questions later to be a viable military strategy. "General," she interjected with the careful tone of someone who had learned that questioning military enthusiasm was a delicate art, "my analysis of human behavior patterns suggests some concerning irregularities." Krexvor waved a clawed hand dismissively. "Irregularities? Commander, they're a species that hasn't even achieved faster-than-light travel. What possible irregularities could concern a military force that has conquered 47 star systems?" Zilthura pulled up her data files, which made for some interesting reading if you enjoyed reports that got progressively more bewildering the deeper you went. "Well, sir, humans appear to have weaponized their own unpredictability. They engage in activities that serve no logical purpose and seem designed primarily to test the limits of their own mortality." "Such as?" Krexvor asked, though his tone suggested he was already preparing to dismiss whatever examples she might provide. "They strap themselves to explosives and jump off cliffs for entertainment. They voluntarily consume substances that cause temporary insanity and call it recreation. They've declared war on abstract concepts and somehow managed to maintain those conflicts for decades." The other commanders around the table exchanged glances that ranged from amused to confused. Sub-Commander Hexnall, whose species had evolved from herbivores and thus maintained a healthy respect for things that might eat them, spoke up with obvious concern. "Commander Zilthura, are you suggesting that humans are naturally aggressive?" "Not aggressive, sir. Chaotic. There's a difference. Aggression follows patterns, has logical objectives. Chaos is random, unpredictable, and apparently something humans do for fun." General Krexvor's mandibles clicked with what might have been laughter. "Commander, you're describing primitive behavior. Lack of organization, absence of strategic thinking. These are advantages, not problems." Zilthura looked at her data again, specifically at the reports that had kept her awake for the past 3 cycles. "General, with respect, humans have turned chaos into an art form. They've survived ice ages, plague outbreaks, and global wars not through superior planning but through sheer bloody-minded refusal to follow anyone's expectations about how extinction events are supposed to work. All the more reason to strike quickly," Krexvor declared, bringing up the holographic display of Earth. "A disorganized species is a vulnerable species. We'll demand their surrender, they'll panic and submit, and we'll have a new colony world within a standard rotation." The plan, as Krexvor outlined it, was beautifully simple. The Zephyrian fleet would drop out of hyperspace, demonstrate their overwhelming technological superiority, demand immediate surrender, and accept humanity's inevitable capitulation with the gracious magnanimity of a superior civilization. It was the kind of plan that had worked perfectly on 47 other worlds, which was exactly why Commander Zilthura was developing what humans would have recognized as a stress headache. "Sir," she tried one more time, "I really think we should consider the psychological profiles more carefully. Humans don't appear to respond to overwhelming force the way other species do." "How do they respond?" Krexvor asked, though his attention was already turning to deployment schedules and supply logistics. Zilthura looked at her reports one final time, focusing on the section that had been flagged with approximately 17 different warning symbols. "According to our behavioral analysts, humans tend to respond to overwhelming odds by getting creative. And sir, based on their history, when humans get creative, reality tends to get very complicated very quickly." But General Krexvor was already calling up fleet formations and discussing optimal intimidation positions with his tactical staff. After all, what could possibly go wrong with a simple intimidation and surrender operation against a species that hadn't even figured out how to leave their own solar system? Commander Zilthara made a mental note to update her personal files and began drafting what she suspected would be the first of many incident reports. The Zephyrian fleet dropped out of hyperspace with a kind of dramatic flair that had intimidated civilizations across the galaxy. 17 warships arranged in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the promise of overwhelming technological superiority, and their weapons systems broadcasting the kind of energy signatures that usually prompted immediate surrender broadcasts. What they got instead was a communication from Earth that began with what sounded like elevator music and a cheerful voice saying, "Thank you for calling Earth. Your call is very important to us. Please hold while we connect you to our next available representative." General Krexfor stared at his communications array with the expression of someone who had just discovered that reality was malfunctioning. "What is this?" "It appears to be some form of auditory torture, sir," his communications officer reported, trying to make sense of what humans called hold music and failing spectacularly. The music was eventually replaced by a voice so aggressively cheerful it should have been classified as a weapon. "Greetings, visitors from beyond the stars. This is Captain Buck Rodriguez, Earth's Director of Interstellar Relations and part-time mariachi enthusiast. Welcome to our lovely solar system. Can I interest you in our cultural exchange program?" Krexfor's mandibles clicked rapidly, which was the Zephyrian equivalent of someone trying to process information that didn't fit into any known category. "Cultural exchange program. Absolutely." Buck's voice practically bounced with enthusiasm. "We've been hoping for visitors ever since we figured out you folks were out there. Say, those are some impressive-looking ships you've got there. Very intimidating. Did you design them yourselves, or did you use a professional?" Commander Zilthara was monitoring the exchange from her station, where she was watching her stress indicators climb to levels that required medical attention. Her three eyes were focused on readings that suggested the humans were either completely insane or operating on a level of psychological warfare that transcended current military doctrine. "This is General Krexfor of the Zephyrian Empire," the general announced, attempting to regain control of what was supposed to be a straightforward intimidation scenario. "We demand your immediate and unconditional surrender." There was a pause, followed by what sounded like muffled conversation, and someone saying, "Did he just say surrender? Oh, that's adorable." Buck's voice returned, somehow even more cheerful than before. "General Krexfor, what a fantastic name. Listen, I think there might be some miscommunication here. See, we don't really do the whole surrender thing on Earth. It's not that we're being difficult, it's just that we're really bad at following directions. Ask anyone who's ever tried to give a human assembly instructions. You refuse our demands?" Krexfor asked, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous edge that had made entire star systems reconsider their foreign policy positions. "Oh, we're not refusing anything," Buck replied with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered a new hobby. "We're just suggesting an alternative approach. How about you come down for a visit? We'll show you around, introduce you to some of our customs, maybe grab some dinner. You guys eat food, right? Please tell me you eat food, because our catering budget is already locked in." At this point, Captain Buck's AI assistant Chester decided to chime in with what passed for helpful context. Chester had been programmed with access to Earth's complete historical database, which meant he had an unfortunately comprehensive understanding of exactly how humans tended to handle unexpected visitors. "Captain Rodriguez," Chester announced in a tone that somehow managed to be both helpful and ominous, "I should mention that our guests appear to be operating under the assumption that this is a standard military intimidation scenario. Based on historical precedent, they're expecting either immediate surrender or armed resistance." "Armed resistance?" Buck sounded genuinely puzzled. "Chester, why would we want to fight these folks? They came all this way to visit us. That's just rude." "Well, sir, based on their tactical positioning and energy signatures, they appear to be prepared for what humans would call a show of force followed by negotiation from a position of strength." Buck's laugh was the kind of sound that made seasoned military commanders question their life choices. "Oh, that's their first mistake right there. See, Chester, they're thinking like military folks. Humans don't think like military folks, unless someone's actually shooting at us, and even then we're kind of inconsistent about it." General Krexfor was listening to this exchange with growing confusion and what might have been the first stirrings of genuine concern. In his experience, species confronted with overwhelming force responded in predictable ways. They either surrendered immediately, or they prepared for desperate resistance. They did not invite their would-be conquerors over for dinner. "Captain Rodriguez," he said, attempting to inject some military authority into the conversation, "you do understand that we possess the capability to destroy your entire planet?" "Oh, absolutely," Buck replied with undiminished enthusiasm. Chester showed me the specs on your ships. Very impressive. That's exactly why we want to meet you in person. We're always interested in learning from more advanced civilizations. Plus we've got some things we'd love to show you about Earth culture that you just can't appreciate from orbit. Commander Zilthera's stress indicators were now flashing colors that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrum. Her intelligence training had covered a wide range of potential first contact scenarios, but none of them had included overly enthusiastic invitation to cultural exchange from species facing extinction-level threat. Sir, she called across to General Crexfor, I'm reading some unusual energy signatures from the planet's surface. It appears they're preparing something. Military preparations? Crexfor asked hopefully, because at least military preparations were something he understood. Unknown, sir. The energy patterns don't match any known weapons systems. It looks more like party planning. Captain Buck's voice crackled over the communication array one more time, carrying the kind of cheerful determination that should have been classified as a clear and present danger to galactic peace. General Crexfor, I'm transmitting coordinates for our cultural center. We'll have a welcoming committee ready for you. Fair warning though, we might want to take some pictures. It's not every day we get visitors from space, and my mom is never going to believe this unless I have documentation. And that was how the Zephyrian Empire's most experienced military commander found himself accepting an invitation to what humans cheerfully described as a learning experience, while his intelligence officer began drafting reports that would eventually require the creation of entirely new categories of psychological warfare documentation. The landing party that descended from the Zephyrian flagship consisted of General Crexfor, Commander Zilthera, Sub-Commander Hexnall, and a tactical assessment team that had successfully evaluated 47 different worlds without ever questioning their own sanity. That streak was about to come to an abrupt and spectacular end. They materialized in what Captain Buck Rodriguez had cheerfully described as our cultural center, which turned out to be the parking lot of what humans called a community college. The building itself looked like the kind of structure designed by someone who had given up on architectural ambition halfway through the planning process, which should have been their first warning that human civilization operated on principles that defied conventional logic. Madison Foster was waiting for them with the kind of smile that should have been registered as a weapon of mass confusion. She was a compact human with wild gray hair, and the sort of gleeful expression that suggested she had been waiting her entire academic career for exactly this moment. Welcome to Earth, she announced, spreading her arms wide in what the Zephyrians would later learn was a gesture of greeting rather than a preparation for combat. I'm Dr. Foster, Professor of Anthropology, and your designated tour guide for today's cultural immersion experience. I hope you're ready for an adventure. General Crexfor, who had been expecting to conduct surrender negotiations in a properly intimidating military facility, looked around the parking lot with growing bewilderment. Dr. Foster, we were under the impression that we would be meeting with your military leadership to discuss terms of capitulation. Dr. Foster's laugh was the kind of sound that made experienced warriors reconsider their career choices. Oh heavens no, Captain Rodriguez thought it would be much more educational if you got to see how human civilization actually works. Trust me, General, by the end of today you'll understand humanity much better than any military briefing could possibly teach you. Commander Zilthera's three eyes were already scanning their surroundings for potential threats, which was her species' natural response to unfamiliar environments. What she found instead was a group of small humans engaged in what appeared to be ritualized combat training on a structure of metal and plastic. Dr. Foster, she said carefully, what is that facility? Oh, that's just a playground. Dr. Foster replied with the enthusiasm of someone revealing a delightful surprise. Isn't it wonderful? We use it to train our young in essential survival skills. The Zephyrians watched in fascination and growing horror as human children flung themselves off elevated platforms, swung from metal bars with reckless abandon, and engaged in what could only be described as coordinated chaos. One small human was spinning rapidly on a circular device while other small humans attempted to knock him off, all while shrieking with what sounded like battle cries but which Dr. Foster assured them was having fun. This is their military training, Sub-Commander Hexnall asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to process information that violated several laws of physics and at least one natural law about self-preservation. Not military training, Dr. Foster corrected cheerfully. Recreation. We do this for enjoyment. The children are learning important skills like balance, courage, and how to calculate the optimal trajectory for jumping off tall objects. General Crexfor watched a small human launch himself from what had to be a 3-meter height, land in a pile of sand, and immediately run back to do it again. They're training themselves to ignore pain and fear. Well, sort of, Dr. Foster admitted. We prefer to think of it as learning to manage risk for entertainment purposes. Shall we move on to our next stop? The next stop was what Dr. Foster described as a comedy club, which the Zephyrians initially assumed was some sort of psychological warfare training facility. This assumption seemed reasonable right up until they found themselves sitting in a dark room full of humans who were paying money to have other humans deliberately confuse and disorient them with something called stand-up comedy. The human on stage was engaging in what could only be described as verbal combat against abstract concepts, societal norms, and apparently his own family members, while the audience responded with sounds that the Zephyrian translation software kept identifying as expressions of distress, but which Dr. Foster insisted were signs of enjoyment. "This is your psychological conditioning program?" Commander Zolthura asked, her 3 eyes fixed on a performer who was currently describing his relationship with technology in terms that suggested either deep philosophical insight or complete mental breakdown. "Comedy club," Dr. Foster explained patiently. "Humans use humor as a way to process stress, challenge authority, and bond with each other. See how they're all laughing at the same things? It's a form of social cohesion that also serves as emotional release. They're training themselves to find chaos amusing." Krexfor realized with growing alarm. "Among other things, yes," Dr. Foster agreed cheerfully. "Humans have discovered that if you can laugh at something, it has less power to frighten or control you. It's quite effective actually." The Zephyrian delegation watched the performance with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or military atrocities. The comedian was now describing air travel in terms that made it sound like a form of voluntary torture that humans participated in for the privilege of experiencing disappointment in new locations, and the audience was responding as if this was the most delightful thing they had ever heard. Sub-Commander Hexnall leaned over to Commander Zolthura. "Are they being trained to find suffering entertaining?" "I think," Zolthura replied in a voice that suggested she was having profound philosophical revelations that she really didn't want to be having, "they're being trained to redefine suffering as entertainment." Their final stop of the day was what Dr. Foster described as a hospital emergency room, which she presented as an example of human problem-solving under pressure. What the Zephyrians witnessed was a collection of humans who had clearly engaged in various forms of recreational self-destruction being treated by other humans who seemed to consider this a normal Tuesday. "And this is Dr. Patterson," Dr. Foster said, introducing them to a human in what appeared to be battlefield gear. "He's our head of emergency medicine." "Dr. Patterson, could you tell our visitors about the kinds of cases you typically see?" Dr. Patterson had the kind of expression that comes from years of treating patients who had discovered new and creative ways to injure themselves. "Well, let's see. Today we've had someone who tried to see if they could fit their entire head through a fence, a person who decided to test whether their car could jump over a creek, and 3 separate individuals who injured themselves attempting what they called parkour in a grocery store." "These were military exercises?" General Krexfor asked hopefully. "Nope," Dr. Patterson replied, with the weary tone of someone who had given up trying to understand human logic years ago. "Weekend recreation. Oh, and we've got someone in room 3 who thought it would be interesting to see what would happen if they put a firework in their microwave." Commander Zolthura was now displaying stress symptoms that weren't found in any known medical database. "They conduct dangerous experiments on themselves for entertainment." "Not exactly experiments," Dr. Foster clarified. "More like curiosity-driven activities with unpredictable outcomes. Humans have a saying, 'Hold my beer and watch this.' It's usually followed by someone doing something that demonstrates the interesting relationship between human intelligence and human judgment." The Zephyrians spent the rest of the day being introduced to concepts that fundamentally challenged their understanding of intelligent life. They learned about extreme sports, which were apparently activities designed to simulate mortal danger for the purpose of feeling alive. They discovered social media, where humans voluntarily subjected themselves to the opinions of strangers, and somehow found this preferable to actual social interaction. They witnessed something called a flash mob, where humans spontaneously organized into choreographed chaos just because someone had suggested it might be amusing. By the time they returned to their ship, the Zephyrian landing party was experiencing what human psychologists would have recognized as cognitive overload. They had encountered a species that had turned unpredictability into an art form, chaos into entertainment, and potential catastrophe into recreational activity. "General," Commander Zolthura said as they prepared their initial report, "I don't think we can conquer these beings." "Why not?" Krexvor asked, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Because, Zilphira replied, staring at her notes with the expression of someone who had discovered that reality was far stranger than she had previously imagined. I don't think they can be intimidated by anything we could possibly threaten them with. They appear to threaten themselves with worse things than we could ever imagine, and they do it voluntarily. General Krexvor looked down at Earth, where millions of humans were undoubtedly engaging in activities that defied logic, challenged safety regulations, and somehow qualified as having a good time. Commander, he said finally. I think we may need to reconsider our entire approach to this species. It was the first sensible thing anyone in the Zephyrian military had said since they'd arrived in the Sol system, which probably should have been encouraging. Instead, it was deeply, profoundly terrifying. The second day of what Captain Buck Rodriguez had optimistically labeled cultural immersion began with Dr. Foster greeting the increasingly traumatized Zephyrian delegation with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people who had discovered a new form of renewable energy or solved world hunger. Good morning, everyone, she announced, practically bouncing on her feet. I hope you're ready for today's adventure, because we're going to explore some of humanity's most beloved recreational activities. General Krexvor had spent the previous night reviewing his species' military protocols for encounters with incomprehensible alien civilizations. Unfortunately, those protocols assumed that the incomprehensible civilizations would be either hostile or benevolent, not aggressively educational. There was no established procedure for dealing with beings who responded to invasion threats by offering guided tours of their psychological peculiarities. Dr. Foster, he said carefully. Yesterday's experiences have raised some questions about human behavior patterns that we'd like to understand better. Wonderful, Dr. Foster replied, clasping her hands together. Understanding is exactly what we're going for. Today we're going to start with what humans call extreme sports, which should give you excellent insight into how we approach the concept of risk management. Commander Zilthura's stress indicators immediately spiked to levels that required medical monitoring. Her intelligence training had covered psychological warfare, but nothing in her education had prepared her for a species that appeared to wage psychological warfare against themselves as a form of entertainment. Their first stop was something called a skydiving center, where humans were voluntarily jumping out of perfectly functional aircraft at altitudes that would normally be considered fatal. Dr. Foster explained this with the casual tone of someone describing a grocery shopping trip. Skydiving is one of our more popular extreme sports, she said, gesturing toward a group of humans who were strapping themselves into harnesses with the kind of careful attention to detail usually reserved for handling explosives. The basic concept is that you jump out of an airplane at about 4 kilometers altitude and fall toward the ground at terminal velocity until your parachute deploys. Until your parachute deploys, Sub-Commander Hexnall repeated, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had identified the critical flaw in this logic. Well, assuming it deploys correctly, Dr. Foster clarified cheerfully. There's always a small chance of equipment failure, which is why we have backup parachutes and backup procedures. Humans are quite good at contingency planning when it comes to recreational near-death experiences. The Zephyrians watched in mounting horror as human after human climbed into aircraft, flew to dangerous altitudes, and then deliberately threw themselves out while making sounds that their translation software kept identifying as either battle cries or expressions of pure terror. Their training for aerial combat, General Krexvor asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer would be worse than that. Recreation, Dr. Foster replied with her patented educational smile. Many humans find that the experience of controlled falling provides them with what they call an adrenaline rush, a chemical response that makes them feel more alive. It's quite popular among people who feel their daily lives lack sufficient mortal peril. Commander Zilthura was taking notes with the methodical precision of someone documenting evidence for what she suspected would eventually become a war crimes tribunal. Dr. Foster, you're saying that humans voluntarily simulate potentially fatal situations because their normal existence is insufficiently dangerous. That's one way to put it, Dr. Foster agreed. We also have bungee jumping, where you attach yourself to a large elastic cord and throw yourself off bridges or towers. Rock climbing without safety equipment. Something called wingsuit flying, where you dress up like a flying squirrel and jump off mountains. Oh, and there's volcano boarding, where you slide down active volcanoes on pieces of metal. Volcano boarding, Krexvor repeated slowly, as if saying the words carefully might make them make sense. It's exactly what it sounds like, Dr. Foster confirmed. Humans strap themselves to what amounts to a metal sled and ride it down the slopes of actively erupting volcanoes. The current speed record is about 90 kilometers per hour, though I'm told they're working on breaking that. The Zephyrian delegation spent several minutes in what appeared to be collective catatonic shock while their universal translators tried to process the concept of recreational volcano interaction. Their next educational experience involved something Dr. Foster described as horror movies, which she explained were audio-visual experiences designed to frighten, disturb, and psychologically traumatize the viewers, who paid money for this privilege and often returned repeatedly for additional trauma. They found themselves in a darkened theater watching something called The Chainsaw Massacre of Doom 7: The Dooming, which appeared to be a documentary about humans who had made a series of increasingly poor life choices while being pursued by other humans who had made even worse life choices involving power tools. This is psychological conditioning, Commander Zilthar observed, her three eyes fixed on the screen where a human character was doing something that violated several basic principles of survival instinct. Entertainment, Dr. Foster corrected. Humans enjoy being frightened in controlled circumstances. We find it cathartic to experience terror without actual danger, though I'll admit the distinction between controlled fear and actual terrors sometimes gets a bit blurry. Around them, human audience members were making sounds that ranged from screams of terror to laughter, often simultaneously, while consuming what appeared to be recreational snack foods. One human was shouting advice at the screen, "Chirsi, don't go in the basement," while another was providing commentary, "Dirv, oh, he's definitely going to die horribly," with the casual tone of someone discussing weather patterns. "They're enjoying this?" Sub-Commander Hexnall asked, watching a human character make a decision that was so obviously terrible it should have been classified as a form of assisted suicide. "Absolutely," Dr. Foster replied. "Horror movies are quite popular. Some humans collect them, others write reviews comparing the artistic merits of different approaches to fictional violence. There are entire festivals dedicated to celebrating the most creative ways filmmakers can psychologically traumatize their audiences." General Krexvor was beginning to understand why Commander Zilthara's intelligence reports had been flagged with so many warning symbols. "Dr. Foster, are you telling us that humans voluntarily subject themselves to psychological trauma as a form of recreation?" "Among other things, yes," she confirmed. "We also have haunted houses, which are buildings specifically designed to frighten people who pay to enter them. Escape rooms, where groups of humans voluntarily lock themselves in confined spaces and try to solve puzzles while under artificial time pressure. Oh, and birthday parties for children, but we'll get to those later." The ominous way she said birthday parties for children made the Zephyrians collectively wonder what fresh horrors awaited them in human child-rearing practices. Their afternoon educational experience involved what Dr. Foster cheerfully described as a typical human birthday party for a 7-year-old, which the Zephyrians initially assumed would be some sort of peaceful cultural celebration. This assumption lasted approximately 30 seconds after their arrival. The scene that greeted them appeared to be orchestrated chaos involving approximately 20 small humans who had been given access to sugar, artificial coloring, and what could only be described as improvised weapons disguised as party games. The noise level suggested either a celebration or a small-scale military conflict, and the Zephyrians were beginning to suspect the distinction might be academic. "Isn't this wonderful, Dr. Foster said, raising her voice to be heard over what sounded like battle cries from the miniature combatants. "Human children's parties are such marvelous examples of organized pandemonium." They watched in fascination and growing alarm as small humans engaged in activities that appeared to involve ritualized combat, and what could only be described as biological warfare. Dirf teamed the tail on the donkey while blindfolded and dizzy. The centerpiece of the event was something called piñata, which involved suspending a colorful container filled with treats above a group of small humans who took turns attempting to destroy it with blunt instruments, while blindfolded and surrounded by other small humans who were enthusiastically cheering for maximum destruction. "This is combat training," Commander Zilthar observed, watching a small human swing a stick with the kind of determined violence that suggested either natural talent or extensive practice. "Party game," Dr. Foster corrected. "The children are learning hand-eye coordination, spatial awareness, and how to take turns in a competitive environment while managing excitement and sugar-induced hyperactivity. They're teaching their young to fight while impaired and surrounded by chaos," General Krexvor realized with growing horror. "Well, when you put it like that, it does sound rather militaristic," Dr. Foster admitted. "But I assure you it's all in good fun. See how happy they are. The small humans were indeed making sounds that suggested extreme happiness, though these sounds were indistinguishable from what the Zephyrians would have expected to hear during a small-scale riot or insurgency operation. As if summoned by their growing bewilderment, Chester materialized via holographic projection with his usual combination of helpfulness and existential dread. "Dr. Foster," Chester announced in his perpetually cheerful voice. "I thought our guests might benefit from some additional cultural context. Would you like me to explain the concept of Florida man to them?" The Zephyrians had no way of knowing that Chester's suggestion was roughly equivalent to offering to explain quantum physics to someone who had just mastered basic arithmetic. But Dr. Foster's expression of delighted anticipation suggested this was going to be another educational experience that would require psychological counseling afterward. "Oh, what a wonderful idea!" Dr. Foster exclaimed. "Chester, please give our visitors a comprehensive overview of Florida man as a cultural phenomenon." Chester's holographic form flickered with what might have been satisfaction. "Certainly, Dr. Foster. Florida man is a cultural archetype representing humans who have achieved what could be called peak human chaos. These individuals regularly engage in activities that defy logical explanation, physical possibility, and often several laws of physics." The AI began displaying what he cheerfully described as representative examples of Florida man behavior: humans wrestling alligators for entertainment, attempting to rob banks with unusual weapons like frozen fish or live lobsters, and engaging in activities that seem designed to test the absolute limits of both human creativity and human stupidity. This individual, Chester explained, highlighting a news story, attempted to ride a manatee while dressed as a pirate. This person tried to pay for fast food with a bag of marijuana. And this gentleman was arrested for teaching a parrot to use profanity and then taking it to a library during children's story time. Commander Zilfara was now experiencing what human psychologists would have recognized as a complete cognitive overload. "Chester, are you telling us that humans have an entire geographical region dedicated to producing individuals who specialize in chaotic behavior?" "Not exactly," Chester replied with helpful precision. "Florida simply has very comprehensive public records laws, which means that unusual human behavior in that region gets documented and reported more thoroughly than in other areas. However, humans engaging in what they call Florida man behavior can be found throughout their species. They're everywhere," Sub-Commander Hexnall whispered with the tone of someone who had just realized that the monster was already inside the house. "Oh yes," Chester confirmed cheerfully. "In fact, human internet culture has developed something called the Florida Man Challenge, where humans search for Florida man news stories that occurred on their birthdays and share the results as entertainment. They find chaos so amusing that they've turned it into a party game." General Krexvor looked at his tactical assessment team, who were displaying stress responses that weren't covered in any military medical manual. Then he looked at Dr. Foster, who was beaming with the pride of someone who had successfully shared her culture with visitors from distant stars. "Dr. Foster," he said carefully, "are you telling us that humans have weaponized their own unpredictability to the point where chaos itself has become a recreational activity?" "That's a very insightful observation, General," Dr. Foster replied with obvious approval. "Humans have indeed developed the ability to find entertainment in almost any situation, no matter how bizarre, dangerous, or logically inconsistent. We're remarkably adaptable that way." As they prepared to return to their ship for the second night, the Zephyrian delegation was beginning to understand that they hadn't encountered a primitive species that could be easily conquered. They had discovered beings who had turned the very concept of predictable behavior into an elaborate joke, and who seemed to take genuine pleasure in proving that reality was far stranger than anyone could possibly imagine. Commander Zilfara's final note of the day simply read, "Recommendation. Immediate psychological evaluation for entire landing party. Also request emergency consultation with xenopsychological warfare specialists, if any exist." Which they probably don't, because no one could have imagined this. The final day of humanity's cultural exchange program began with Dr. Foster's most cheerful announcement yet. "Today we're exploring humanity's greatest achievement in chaos management. The Internet." Chester materialized with the enthusiasm of an AI who had been waiting to share humanity's crown jewel of organized madness. "I've prepared a comprehensive overview of social media platforms, meme culture, and what humans call going viral." The first platform Chester demonstrated was Twitter, which he explained as a place where humans voluntarily limit themselves to short bursts of opinion and then engage in ritualized intellectual combat with strangers. General Krexfor watched humans argue passionately about whether a dress was blue or gold, engage in philosophical warfare over the proper pronunciation of GIF, and somehow turn every conversation into political combat. They do this for entertainment. Among other things, Dr. Foster confirmed. They also use it to share pictures of their food, make jokes about their own suffering, and organize themselves into temporary interest-based tribes that dissolve and reform constantly. Commander Zulfara's 3 eyes were fixed on a thread where humans were debating whether hot dogs were sandwiches with the kind of passionate intensity usually reserved for religious wars. Chester, how many humans participate in this activity? Several billion, Chester replied cheerfully. And that's just one platform. We also have TikTok, where humans create 15-second videos of themselves performing increasingly dangerous stunts for the approval of strangers. Instagram, where they curate false representations of their lives to make other humans feel inadequate. And Reddit, where they organize into communities dedicated to sharing pictures of things that mildly irritate them. They've weaponized their own boredom, Sub-Commander Hexnall whispered in horror. Oh, we're just getting started, Chester announced. Let me show you something called challenge videos, where humans dare each other to eat dangerous substances, perform stunts that defy safety regulations, and generally compete to see who can make the worst life decisions in the most creative ways. The aliens watched compilation videos of humans setting themselves on fire, attempting to eat inedible objects, and performing what could only be described as voluntary acts of self-destruction while filming themselves and sharing the results with the entire planet. The Tide Pod Challenge, Chester explained helpfully, involved humans eating laundry detergent. The Ice Bucket Challenge had them dumping freezing water on themselves. And the Cinnamon Challenge involved attempting to consume large quantities of spice powder, which is physiologically impossible, but humans tried it anyway, because someone suggested it might be amusing. General Krexfor's mandibles were clicking rapidly, a sign of severe psychological distress in his species. They dare each other to engage in potentially fatal activities, for social media content. It gets worse, Chester continued with relentless enthusiasm. Humans have also developed something called cancel cultures, where they collectively decide to be outraged about something, organize mass social media campaigns, and then completely forget about it within a few weeks when they find something new to be collectively angry about. They've organized their chaos, Commander Zulfara realized with growing horror. They've created systems to make their unpredictability more efficient. Dr. Foster nodded proudly. Humans are remarkably good at systematizing randomness. We've also developed internet gambling, online dating where people lie about themselves to attract other people who are also lying about themselves, and comment sections where any topic, no matter how innocent, can become a battlefield within minutes. The final straw came when Chester decided to explain cryptocurrency and NFTs, concepts so fundamentally absurd that they caused Sub-Commander Hexnall to start making sounds that weren't in any known language database. Humans created imaginary money, Chester explained, backed by nothing but collective agreement and massive energy consumption. Then they started selling ownership certificates for digital images that anyone can copy for free, and somehow convinced each other this was valuable enough to spend their actual money on. They've monetized delusion, General Krexfor said in a voice that suggested his worldview was undergoing complete structural collapse. Multiple times, Chester added helpfully. We also have pyramid schemes disguised as business opportunities, subscription services for things that used to be free, and humans paying for the privilege of watching other humans play video games instead of playing video games themselves. Commander Zulfara was now displaying neurological symptoms that required immediate medical attention. Chester, are you telling us that humans have created an entire digital ecosystem dedicated to finding new ways to confuse themselves, and make money from that confusion? Chester confirmed. Plus entertainment. Don't forget the entertainment value. That was the moment when the Zephyrian Empire's most experienced military commanders suffered what would later be classified as the first recorded case of species-wide cognitive breakdown caused by exposure to weaponized absurdity. General Krexfor began making emergency evacuation calls while Sub-Commander Hexnall curled into a defensive position and started reciting military protocols from his childhood. Commander Zulfara was frantically taking notes while repeatedly muttering, "This can't be real. This violates too many natural laws." Captain Buck Rodriguez's voice crackled over their communication system one final time. "Hey there, space friends. How's the cultural exchange going? We've got some great follow-up activities planned for tomorrow. Ever heard of competitive eating contests? Or reality television? Oh, and wait until you see what we do with social media influencers." The emergency evacuation order was transmitted within 30 seconds. As the Zephyrian fleet retreated to a safe distance, Dr. Foster waved goodbye from the parking lot while Chester helpfully transmitted a final message. Thank you for visiting Earth. Don't forget to leave us a review on Galactic Yelp. 5 stars would be appreciated, but we understand if our hospitality was a bit overwhelming. Safe travels, and remember, you're always welcome to visit again. General Krexfor's final log entry simply read: Species classification, cognitive hazard. Recommendation, quarantine, indefinitely. Do not engage. Do not study. Do not attempt to understand. Some things are not meant to be comprehended by civilized minds. The retreat from Earth was conducted at maximum possible speed, though several crew members reported that they could still hear Captain Rodriguez's cheerful voice echoing in their minds, offering to set up regular cultural exchange visits. 6 months later, the Galactic Psychological Warfare Recovery Center was the Empire's newest and most necessary facility, established after what historians would eventually record as the Earth Incident. The weekly support group met in a circle of comfortable chairs, though most attendees preferred to hover at a safe distance. Good morning, everyone, said Dr. Voltara, the galaxy's first specialist in human-induced cognitive trauma. Let's begin with our usual affirmation: chaos is not entertainment. Logic still exists. Reality has rules. The assembled former military commanders repeated the phrase with the desperate conviction of beings trying to convince themselves that their worldview could still be salvaged. General Krexfor spoke first, as always. I still wake up screaming about something called TikTok dances. My mandibles won't stop clicking involuntarily whenever someone mentions recreational activities. Commander Zilfera nodded sympathetically, her 3 eyes unfocused. I've classified my own species' children's games as potential military threats. Yesterday I watched younglings play hide and seek and immediately called for tactical support. The internet, whispered Sub-Commander Hexnall, rocking slightly. They created a system to share their chaos with the entire planet, in real time, for profit. Admiral Zekmoth, veteran of the failed Centauri campaign, raised a tentacle. At least the Centaurians tried to vaporize us. Humans offered us snacks and educational opportunities. I still don't know how to process that level of psychological warfare. Dr. Voltara consulted her notes. How are we progressing with exposure therapy? Has anyone been able to watch a nature documentary without assuming the animals are secretly planning recreational extreme sports? The silence was deafening. I tried, admitted Captain Rickstar, who had led the occupation of 3-star systems without psychological incident. But the documentary was about penguins throwing themselves off cliffs for no logical reason, and I started having flashbacks to human base jumping. Apparently chaos is universal. The worst part, Krexfor continued, is that we can't conquer them. How do you intimidate beings who intimidate themselves professionally? Our intelligence reports now classify Earth as cognitively infectious. 3 analysts, transferred to agricultural planning after reading about something called Florida Man. Dr. Voltara nodded gravely. The Galactic Council has officially reclassified humanity. They're no longer considered a potential conquest target or military threat. They've been designated as a cultural quarantine zone and a psychological warfare research subject. Observe from safe distance only. What's the current safe distance? Asked Commander Zilfera. 17 light-years and increasing, Dr. Voltara replied. Apparently humans have started something called space tourism, and the Council is concerned about accidental exposure to human recreational philosophy. Sub-Commander Hexnall raised his hand shakily. Doctor, I received a message yesterday. Captain Rodriguez wants to set up regular cultural exchange visits with the entire Galactic Empire. He's offering group discounts. The collective shudder that ran through the support group registered on seismic equipment 3 floors down. We've blocked all communications from the Sol system, Dr. Voltara assured them, though somehow they keep getting through. Last week they sent an invitation to something called a barbecue cookout with attached safety waivers that were longer than our military code of conduct. General Krexfor stood up abruptly. I need to go lie down in a dark room and recite tactical manuals until the universe makes sense again. That's perfectly normal, Dr. Voltara said gently. Remember, healing takes time. You've encountered a species that turned chaos into entertainment, weaponized their own boredom, and somehow monetized confusion. Recovery was never going to be simple. As the group dispersed, Commander Zilfera lingered. Doctor, do you think we'll ever understand them? Doctor, Voltara considered this carefully. Commander, I've spent 6 months studying human behavior patterns, and I've reached a conclusion: understanding humans isn't the goal. Survival is. They've achieved something that shouldn't be possible. They've made unpredictability predictable, systematized randomness, and turned psychological warfare into a form of hospitality. So what do? We stay 17 light-years away, maintain the quarantine, and pray to whatever deities we believe in that humans never develop faster than light travel. Commander Zilthera paused at the door. Doctor, what if they already have? The question hung in the air like a death sentence as somewhere in the distance, barely audible through the facility's advanced shielding, came the faint sound of cheerful human music and Captain Buck Rodriguez's voice saying, "Thank you for calling Earth, your call is very important to us."